The diary sits in a climate-controlled drawer at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Leather cover warped by moisture, pages foxed brown at the edges, 3 entries partially illegible where something, rain, sweat, maybe blood, soaked through the binding. The officer who wrote it, a Panzer IV commander attached to the 136th Panzer Brigade, never intended anyone outside his family to read these pages. He certainly never intended Americans to read them. But he stopped writing on the 23rd of September, 1944, somewhere east of Arracourt, and the diary turned up in a knocked-out Panzer weeks later, stuffed inside a map case alongside a photograph of a woman and 2 children. 3 entries matter. September 19th. Destroyed 2 Shermans at 800 meters, both burned. A third appeared from behind the second wreck before the smoke cleared and put around through Feldwebel-Brandt's turret ring. Where do they keep finding them? September 20th. Engaged 4 Shermans in open ground south of Lizy, knocked out the lead tank. The second stopped, reversed into a tree line, and reappeared on our flank within minutes. The same tank, I am certain, because the antenna mount hung broken at the same angle. They do not behave like men who expect to die. September 21st. And this is the entry that caught the attention of the intelligence officer who eventually catalogued the diary. Just one line. Sie kämpfen, als könnten sie nicht getötet werden. They fight like they can't be killed. Not a compliment, a complaint. The frustration of a professional who followed Doctrine, scored hits, watched American tanks burn, and somehow kept facing more of them, crewed by men who showed no apparent awareness that their vehicle was mechanically inferior. How did crews in a tank with thinner armor and a lower velocity gun keep pressing attacks against Panthers and Panzer IVs that outgunned them? Why did standard German ambush tactics, the kind that collapsed French armored divisions in 6 weeks during 1940, fail to break American tank platoons that took 50% casualties and came back the same afternoon? What made these men fight as though the mathematics of armor penetration didn't apply to them? If you want to understand what that German officer collided with, and I mean really understand it, not the Hollywood version, do me a favor. Hit subscribe so this channel keeps showing up for you. Drop a like on this video, and when we're done, go dig into the Arracourt records yourself and tell me in the comments what surprised you most. Because the answer isn't courage. Courage is generic. Every army has courage. The answer is a system, a specifically American system, that made courage survivable. The full picture takes some building, so to understand why a professional German tanker sounded baffled in his own private diary, we need to go back to a doctrine and a supply chain that fed a training pipeline the Wehrmacht had no framework to comprehend, one that turned the Sherman's worst weakness into something unrecognizable. But first, the ambush. September 19th, 1944. Fog thick enough to cut visibility to 200 meters in the rolling farmland east of Arracourt, France. A column of CCA, Combat Command A, 4th Armored Division, pushing east toward Chateau Salin. 5 M4 Shermans of the 37th Tank Battalion nose through a gap between 2 wood lines at a walking pace, hatches open because the fog makes vision blocks useless. The lead Sherman's commander stands chest high in his cupola, squinting into gray nothing. He hears the shot before he sees the muzzle flash, a flat, hard crack that arrives simultaneously with the strike on the second tank in line. The 75mm round from a concealed Panzer IV punches through the Sherman's hull side at a range later estimated at 400 meters. The tank lurches, smoke pours from the engine deck, 2 crewmen bail out the turret hatch within 4 seconds. The 3rd Sherman in column traverses its turret left, hunting for the source. A second German round hits the dirt 10 feet short, skips, and gouges a trench in the mud without striking anything. The 4th, Sherman's gunner spots the muzzle flash through a momentary thinning in the fog and puts a 75mm round into the tree line. Miss. He fires again. The German Panzer reverses into cover, and here, right here, is where German tactical expectations broke down. Doctrine said the Americans should pull back, regroup, call for artillery. Every other army the Wehrmacht had faced did exactly that, after losing a vehicle to an unseen ambush in zero visibility conditions. The Shermans did not pull back. The platoon leader radioed his company commander, and within 90 seconds, 3 Shermans from the adjacent platoon swung north through a farm road the Germans hadn't scouted. They appeared on the German flank 7 minutes later. The Panzer IV that had sprung the ambush took a round through the engine compartment and burned. 5-1. You've heard it. Every documentary, every History Channel marathon, every forum argument since the internet discovered World War II. It takes 5 Shermans to kill 1 tiger. The number floats around like gospel, and it has poisoned almost everything the general public thinks about American armor in the European theater. So where did it come from? Not from any after-action report filed by the 4th Armored Division, not from any operational research study conducted by the U.S. Army. The ratio traces to a garbled reading of Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall's post-war interviews and a selective misquotation of a British operational research report that examined a completely different question, not how many Shermans it took to destroy a tiger, but what the average numerical advantage of the attacking force needed to be before a platoon leader felt confident initiating contact against a defended position containing any anti-tank threat. That includes dug-in 75mm PAK guns, infantry with Panzerfausts, hull-down assault guns, and yes, occasionally, a Tiger. The 5-to-1 figure described a general combined arms planning ratio for offensive action. It had nothing to do with single-vehicle dueling. Somebody stripped the context, and the myth metastasized. It gets worse. The Germans themselves, the people supposedly racking up these lopsided kills, found the idea laughable when American intelligence officers pressed them on it after the war. The Foreign Military Studies program, run by the U.S. Army Historical Division starting in 1946, recruited dozens of former Wehrmacht generals and senior officers to write structured analyses of their wartime experience. General Major F.W. von Mellenthin, who served as Chief of Staff for multiple Panzer Corps on both the Eastern and Western fronts, addressed American armor directly in FMS, manuscript P-0-4-9. His assessment of the Sherman focused on its mechanical reliability, the speed of American crew replacement, the consistent availability of ammunition and fuel, and the sheer density of armored vehicles at every point of contact. He did not describe a tank that required a 5-to-1 advantage to function. He described a tank that kept showing up. Von Mellenthin's exact phrasing, and I'll give you the English translation from the Historical Division's own rendering, called American armored units inexhaustible in their ability to absorb losses and maintain offensive tempo. Inexhaustible, from a man who watched the 6th Panzer Army burn through its last reserves in the Ardennes. The actual kill data tells a different story than the myth allows, gruesome but clarifying. The Ballistic Research Laboratory at Aberdeen Proving Ground conducted a survey of knocked-out American armored vehicles in the European theater, cataloging penetration angles, weapon types, and engagement ranges across hundreds of wrecks. Their findings, published in 1945, the majority of Sherman losses, north of 60%, came from towed anti-tank guns and self-propelled assault guns, like the Sturmgeschütz III, not from tank-on-tank engagements. The PAK-40, a 75mm towed gun that weighed barely a ton and could be hidden behind a hedgerow or inside a barn foundation, killed more Shermans than every Tiger battalion on the Western Front combined. The records from the Ordnance Department's gruesome vehicle-by-vehicle damage assessments don't lie about this. When a Sherman burned, odds favored a concealed gun crew over a Panzer Ace. Why does this matter for Arracourt? Because the 136th Panzer Brigade arrived in Lorraine, expecting the myth to be real. Their commanders, many of them Eastern Front veterans transferred west after the summer disasters in Byelorussia, carried assumptions built on fighting Soviet armor in 1943, where T-34 crews often operated with minimal radio communication, limited tactical autonomy at the platoon level, and replacement drivers who sometimes had fewer than 5 hours of stick time before their first combat action. German tactical planning in September 1944 still assumed that killing the lead tank in a column would stall the entire formation, that the survivors would mill, lose coherence, wait for orders from battalion. That shock and confusion would buy time to displace and set up the next ambush. This template worked against early war French formations. British tank columns in the desert crumbled the same way when Rommel paired concealed 88s with forward panzer screens. On the Eastern Front, it worked often enough to feel like a law of physics. The 4th Armored Division broke that template in the first 72 hours at Arracourt. Not because the Sherman had suddenly become a better tank. The M4 with the 75mm gun remained outgunned by the Panzer IV's long-barreled KWK-40 at anything beyond 500 meters and hopelessly outmatched by the Panther's 75mm L-70. The armor didn't change. The gun didn't change. What the German officer in that diary collided with operated at a level he couldn't see from his commander's cupola, a level beneath the steel, inside the training pipeline, the communications net, the replacement system, and a maintenance philosophy that treated tanks as expendable nodes in a network rather than irreplaceable capital assets. That system started 2 years earlier and 4,000 miles west in the red dirt of central Louisiana. The best tank in the world is the one that's there. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the same Abrams they'd later name a tank after, said something close to that during the Lorraine campaign, though the exact phrasing varies depending on who's telling the story. The sentiment doesn't vary at all. It captures everything the Shermans' designers intended, and everything the Shermans' critics have spent 80 years missing. Camp Polk, Louisiana, summer of 1942. Red clay dust coats everything: uniforms, goggles, the insides of engine compartments. The Armored Force Training Center sprawls across piney flatlands and swamp, and the air sits on your chest like a wet blanket from May through October. This is where the system began. Rows of M4 Shermans fresh from the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, lined up on hardstand with their engines still ticking from the rail journey south. Walk past them, and they all look the same. 33 tons, 66 inches of turret ring, a Continental R975 radial engine hanging in the back hull like an aircraft power plant bolted into a steel box, because that's exactly what it started as. The Wright Whirlwind radial from 1930s aircraft, adapted, detuned to 400 horsepower, and mounted with 5 bolts and a universal engine cradle that let a trained crew swap the entire power plant in 4 hours. 4 hours. A Panther's Maybach, HL-230, required a specialized maintenance company, a gantry crane, and the better part of 2 days, if the parts existed, which by 1944 they frequently did not. The Sherman's radial engine could be pulled with a pair of chain hoists rigged to a log tripod. Crews did this in orchards, in bombed-out barns, in the rain, with 3 men and a case of sea rations. The design didn't just allow field repair, it assumed field repair as the baseline operating condition. Every major component, transmission, final drives, engine, turret basket, attached to the hull through standardized bolt patterns, sized for tools already in the inventory. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Fisher Body, American Locomotive, Press Steel Car Company, Federal Machine and Welder, Pacific Car and Foundry. 11 plants built Shermans across 7 variants, and a final drive from a Ford-built M4A3, mated to a hull from a pressed steel M4A1 without modification. Interchangeability at industrial scale. The Wehrmacht had nothing like it. German tank production relied on hand-fitted tolerances, subcontractor-specific components, and a philosophy rooted in craftsmanship rather than volume. A beautiful philosophy if you're building watches. Fatal if you're trying to replace 40 tanks a week across a 1,000-mile front. Now, walk into an ordnance maintenance battalion's forward collecting point. Say, the gruesome yard behind the 502nd Ordnance Heavy Maintenance Company, operating east of Nancy in late September 1944. The smell hits first: burned rubber, hydraulic fluid, scorched steel, and something worse underneath that nobody talks about in memoirs. Shermans sit in rows with their damage visible like autopsy subjects. Turret penetrations punched clean through both sides. Hull plates bulged inward, where a PAK-40 round didn't fully penetrate, but spalled lethal fragments off the interior wall. track sections sheared by mines draped over the fenders like broken jewelry. Ordnance crews, mechanics, not tankers, crawl over these wrecks with cutting torches, socket sets, and a ruthlessly practical triage system. Category A, repairable in the field within 24 hours. Category B, repairable at the collecting point within 72 hours. Category C, evacuate to a rear depot. Category D, strip for parts and scrap the hull. A Sherman with a destroyed engine but intact running gear gets a new power plant and rolls back to the line before the crew that lost it finishes their 48-hour rest rotation. A Sherman with a turret penetration but functional automotive components donates its transmission and final drives to 2 other tanks waiting on parts. Nothing is wasted. The supply chain operates like a circulatory system. Damaged cells recycled, fresh ones pushed forward. The 4th Armored Division lost 91 Shermans at Arracourt between September 19th and September 29th. 91 tanks in 11 days. They ended the battle with more operational Shermans than they started with. Read that again, because it's the fact that explains the diary. They lost 91 tanks and came out stronger. The ordnance pipeline pushed replacements forward faster than German guns could destroy them. Fresh M4s arrived on tank transporters from depots near Verdun. Crews married up with their new vehicles, zeroed the main gun on a hillside behind the lines, and rolled back into contact. The German planning assumption that losses were cumulative and each kill permanently degraded the enemy formation. That attrition worked in their favor because their tanks cost more kills per vehicle, shattered against a logistics architecture that simply refused to deplete. The panzer officer in that diary watched Shermans burn and counted kills. The kills were real. The depletion wasn't. 14. That's how many tank crews Sergeant Bob Early served with between Normandy and the Elbe. Not 14 tanks, 14 crews. The distinction matters. Early survived vehicles that didn't, climbed out of hatches trailing smoke, walked to the rear, drew a fresh Sherman from the replacement pool, met 4 men he'd never spoken to, and rolled back into the war. He did this so many times that by the autumn of 1944, he'd stopped learning last names until a crew survived its 3rd engagement together. The 3rd Armored Division, Spearhead, burned through equipment at a rate that would have clinically killed any panzer division on the German order of battle. They reported roughly 700 tank losses across the entire European campaign. The division's authorized strength never exceeded 232 medium tanks at any given time. Do the arithmetic. They went through their entire fleet roughly 3 times over. The Wehrmacht would call that annihilation. The U.S. Army called it Tuesday. The engagement that crystallized this system into something the Germans couldn't process happened on a stretch of road between Mons and Namur in early September 1944. Though sourcing the exact date remains difficult, Makos reconstructs it from crew interviews conducted decades later, and the 3rd Armored Division's daily operations log for that week contains a gap of 11 hours on one critical day. No explanation. The log simply resumes with new grid coordinates and a revised vehicle status report. What the crew accounts agree on: a column of Shermans from Task Force X, the division's ad hoc combined arms formation, pushed along a road flanked by rising ground on both sides. Classic killbox terrain. Hedgerows thick enough to hide a barn. Gentle ridgelines that gave hull-down positions to anything sitting 200 meters back from the crest. 10 panzers sat on the forward ridge. 5 more waited behind the column, blocking the retreat route. The ambush opened from the front. 2 rounds in rapid succession knocked out the lead Sherman and the 3rd vehicle in line, splitting the column into segments that couldn't support each other. A Panther on the left ridge put a 75mm round through an M4A1's turret face at under 600 meters. The tank didn't burn immediately. It sat motionless for 4 seconds, then smoke began curling from the commander's hatch. 3 men got out. The gunner and bow gunner did not. Standard ambush. Textbook German execution. Crossfire from elevated positions. Escape route sealed. Retreat blocked. Defenders fragmented. On the Eastern Front, this produced surrender or slaughter within minutes. Here, something different happened. The surviving Sherman crews did not dismount and scatter into the ditches. The tank commanders, who still had functional vehicles, began calling adjustments over the radio, not to battalion, not up the chain, but laterally to each other. Sergeant Early's Sherman, fourth in the column, reversed into a shallow drainage culvert that dropped the hull below the Panther's line of fire. His gunner traversed right and engaged a Panzer IV on the opposite ridge at a range he later estimated, probably generously, at 900 meters. Missed second round hit the Panzer's track assembly and immobilized it. Meanwhile, the crews from the two burning Shermans at the front of the column did something that violated every assumption German tactical planners held about what happened after a tank kill. They ran toward the rear of the column, not away from the battle. One crew, loader, gunner, commander, 3 men from a dead tank, reached an undamaged Sherman whose own crew had bailed after a near-miss concussion, cracked the driver's periscope, and disoriented the bow gunner. The orphaned crew climbed in, restarted the engine, and began engaging targets within approximately 90 seconds of losing their original vehicle. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division and later wrote extensively for the FMS program, described a pattern he called completely alien to German experience. The American tank crews appeared to regard the loss of a vehicle as a temporary inconvenience rather than a decisive event. His phrasing: temporary inconvenience. A 33-ton machine full of gasoline and ammunition gets penetrated by a high-velocity tungsten core round, kills 2 of 5 crewmen, and the survivors treat it like a flat tire. The ambush unraveled in under 20 minutes. American artillery, called by a forward observer riding in an M20 armored car at the column's tail, dropped 105mm concentrations on the southern ridge within 6 minutes of the first shot, 6 minutes from contact to steel on target. The panzers on the blocking position behind the column pulled back rather than absorb the barrage. 2 of the 10 forward panzers burned. 3 more withdrew with damage. The Americans lost 4 Shermans destroyed and 2 damaged. All 4 destroyed vehicles sat in the road with their hulls still smoking when replacement M4s arrived from the divisional maintenance collecting point 8 hours later. 4 tanks dead. 0 crews permanently lost to the division. The men who climbed out of those wrecks drew fresh machines the next morning. But what happens when the system meets a target it literally cannot kill? Corporal Francis Wehrling found out on a gray morning in the hedgerow country south of St. Lo, July 1944, when his Sherman's 75mm gun ran into 56 tons of reasons to reconsider the engagement. The Tiger sat at the far end of a shallow valley. Hull angled slightly toward the approaching American platoon. Turret traversed about 15 degrees left, its 88mm KWK, 36 pointed at something Wehrling couldn't see from his position. Range, roughly 800 meters. His platoon leader ordered the advance. Wehrling's gunner put the first round center mass on the Tiger's glacis plate. The tracer bounced off like a lit cigarette flicked against a brick wall. Second round, same result. A bright streak arcing upward into the overcast after deflecting off sloped armor that the 75mm M61 APC round simply could not penetrate at that distance. The ballistics aren't complicated. The M61 carried a muzzle velocity of 2,030 feet per second and could defeat roughly 3.5 inches of face-hardened armor at 500 yards. The Tiger's frontal plate ran 4 inches thick at a modest slope. The math didn't work. Wehrling's crew knew the math didn't work after the 3rd round. They kept firing. 4th round, 5th. The Sherman rocked on its suspension with each shot, spent brass clanging into the turret basket, the loader grabbing fresh rounds from the ready rack with a rhythm that bordered on mechanical. Smoke filled the fighting compartment. The ventilation fan in the M4's turret couldn't clear propellant gases fast enough during rapid fire, and the crew breathed through a haze that stung their eyes and coated their tongues with a chemical bitterness that lingered for hours after the engagement. 10th round. The Tiger still hadn't returned fire on Wehrling's tank specifically. It engaged another Sherman in the platoon. 1 round, 1 kill. The target brewing up instantly in a column of orange flame and black petroleum smoke that marked the spot like a signal flare. Wehrling's gunner shifted aim to the Tiger's track assembly. Missed low. Tried again. The round struck dirt 2 feet short and sprayed the Tiger's hull with mud and gravel. Back to the turret face. Round 13, or 14. Accounts blur here, because Wehrling reconstructed the count after the fact and the loader lost track entirely. Every impact threw sparks off the Tiger's armor, bright white flashes against gray steel in gray light. From inside the Tiger, those hits sounded like sledgehammer blows on a cathedral bell, deafening, disorienting, but not lethal. The crew buttoned up and kept fighting. The armor held. 20 rounds gone from the ready rack. Wehrling's loaders started pulling from the hull storage bins, a slower process that required him to twist his body down and left, grab a round from the protected sponson rack, and pass it up to the gun breech. Rate of fire dropped. The gunner kept shooting. 21, 22. Somewhere around round 25, the Tiger's turret finally traversed toward Wehrling's Sherman. The 88 needed 1 round. It punched through the Sherman's front hull plate, 2 inches of cast armor that might as well have been cardboard against a projectile carrying nearly 3 times the kinetic energy of anything Wehrling could throw back. The tank filled with light and noise and fragments. Wehrling felt heat before he understood what had happened. Hydraulic fluid from the turret traverse mechanism sprayed across the fighting compartment and ignited. The driver and bow gunner went out through their hatches. Wehrling and the gunner went out through the turret. The loader didn't make it, trapped beneath the gun breech when the turret jolted off its race from the impact. 4 men stood in a French field, watching their Sherman burn. They'd fired more than 25 rounds at a single target and achieved exactly nothing against its armor. Their loader died in the wreck behind them. The correct emotional response by any reasonable human standard involves grief and rage, and the recognition that continuing to fight this particular enemy in this particular vehicle constitutes a form of mechanical suicide. Wehrling walked to the rear, found a replacement Sherman that had arrived on a transporter that same morning, climbed in with 3 surviving crewmates and 1 replacement loader he'd never met, and drove back toward the line. The 2nd Armored Division's after-action report for that week records his platoon's engagement without editorial comment. Rounds expended, casualties sustained, vehicles lost, vehicles replaced. The bureaucratic flatness of the report tells you everything about how the system processed events that should have been psychologically devastating. 1 tank burned, another tank arrived. The war continued. Wehrling fought through Normandy, through the Siegfried Line, into Germany. The records don't indicate whether he ever engaged another Tiger. They do confirm he finished the war alive, which puts him in a statistical minority among Sherman crewmen who served from July 1944 through VE Day. 25 rounds of nothing, a dead loader, a burning tank, and the man got back in another one. The word for that isn't courage, at least not in the conventional sense. Destruction had become procedural. Lose the tank, walk to the rear, draw another, zero the gun, roll forward. General Major Werner Panzermeier, not his real surname, though the nickname stuck so completely that even American interrogators used it in their files, sat in a wooden chair at the Trent Park estate outside London in December 1944, speaking to a fellow captured officer whose lapel pin microphone fed every word to a recording device in the basement. He leaned forward and said something that the British transcriptionists underlined twice. They build tanks the way we build ammunition crates. The recording survives. Declassified in 2004, catalogued in Neitzel's collection, the tape hiss nearly swallowing the quieter German's reply. Panzermeier wasn't finished. He described watching, from a command post overlooking a valley near Mortain, in August 1944, days before his capture, an American armored column absorb 5 direct kills from concealed PAK-43 positions, lose 5 Shermans in under 3 minutes, and continue advancing without pausing to recover crews or vehicles. Fresh tanks appeared from behind a tree line 400 meters to the rear. They drove around the burning wrecks. 1 replacement Sherman passed so close to a still-burning hull that its olive-drab paint blistered along the right sponson from radiant heat. The crew didn't stop. Panzermeier used a word the translator rendered as conveyor belt, fleece band, and then corrected himself. No, a conveyor belt can be shut off. Behind that column, behind the tree line, behind the depot at Isigny-sur-Mer, behind the beach dumps still swelling with materiel 6 weeks after D-Day, behind the Liberty ships stacked in channel anchorages waiting to unload, behind all of it sat Detroit. The numbers answer the diary. The United States produced 49,234 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1945. Germany produced roughly 6,000 Panther tanks and 1,447 Tiger ones across the same period. Add every Panzer IV produced after 1942, another 5,000 or so, and the entire German medium and heavy tank output still falls below 16,000 vehicles. The Americans built 3 Shermans for every German tank of any type, but production volume alone doesn't explain what Panzermeier saw at Mortain. Volume without distribution is just a parking lot. The actual mechanism that made destroyed Shermans reappear like a biological process involved a chain of interlocking systems that no other nation on Earth could have assembled in the 20th century. Start at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan. The plant covered 346 acres under one roof, a single building larger than some European airfields. Raw steel entered one end, finished M4, A4 Shermans rolled off the other end at a peak rate of 1 tank every 26 minutes during the spring of 1944. 26 minutes. A German crew needed longer than that to bore sight their optics after a replacement gun installation. Each completed Sherman drove under its own power to a rail loading dock, climbed onto a flat car, and began a journey that ended at one of 6 port facilities on the eastern seaboard: Newark, Baltimore, Hampton Roads. The tanks crossed the Atlantic in the holds of Victory ships, stacked too high with their turrets traversed rear and locked, gun tubes capped against salt spray, engines preserved with cosmoline that maintenance crews would spend 45 minutes cleaning from cylinder heads before first start at the receiving depot. Cherbourg, then Boulogne, then a forward supply dump within 60 miles of the front, then a divisional maintenance collecting point, then a tank transporter. The M25 Dragon Wagon, a 40-ton prime mover hauling an M15A1 trailer, specifically designed to carry a Sherman at road speed. The entire pipeline from factory floor to frontline crew took between 42 and 56 days, depending on shipping availability and weather in the Channel. Less than 2 months from molten steel in Michigan to a gunner's hand on a firing switch in France. The German officer in that diary wrote his entry sometime in mid-October 1944. He'd spent 3 weeks watching his company's kill count rise while American operational strength refused to drop. His Panzer IV battalion had started September with 31 tanks, attrition, breakdowns, and a chronic shortage of replacement engines. The Maybach factories had been bombed twice by 8th Air Force B-17s that summer, left him with 11 operational vehicles by the time he wrote those words. 11 from 31, with no replacements scheduled. Across the line, the American division opposing him had lost more tanks than his entire battalion owned and fielded more Shermans on October 15th than on September 1st. He didn't know about Warren, Michigan. He didn't know about the Dragon Wagons or the Victory ships or the 26-minute production cycle. All he knew, all he could see from his cupola, were Shermans burning, and Shermans replacing them in quantities that defied every model of attrition warfare he'd trained on. So he wrote the only thing that made sense from inside his frame of reference. They fought like they couldn't be killed. He meant it as awe. It functioned as diagnosis. The crews couldn't be killed because the system behind them had made the individual tank disposable. A component, not a creature. Destroy one, and the factory exhaled another. The Germans tried everything rational before concluding the problem had no rational solution. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff for the 7th Army, submitted a tactical memorandum in late September 1944 proposing what he called systemic kill doctrine, a shift from destroying individual tanks to destroying the replacement mechanism behind them. Target the maintenance collecting points, mine the supply roads, concentrate Luftwaffe ground attack sorties against the Dragon Wagon convoys, hauling fresh Shermans forward. Cut the umbilical, and the American armor would bleed out like any other force. The memorandum ran 11 pages. 7th Army Headquarters approved it within 48 hours, which tells you how desperate the command climate had become. Gersdorff's plan contained one assumption that invalidated the entire concept. It presumed the Luftwaffe could achieve local air superiority over supply routes for sustained periods. By October 1944, the Luftwaffe couldn't achieve local air superiority over its own airfields, so the tactical units adapted on their own. Panzer and Panzerjäger commanders lengthened their kill zones, setting ambushes at 1,200 meters instead of 600, hoping that greater range would allow more kills before the surviving Shermans could close and call artillery. The logic held on paper. In practice, the longer engagement range reduced German first-round hit probability from roughly 70% to under 40%, and the additional 30 seconds of flight time gave American tank commanders enough warning to pop smoke and scatter. The kill rate per ambush dropped. Meanwhile, the replacement rate didn't. Mixed anti-tank tactics came next. Infantry Panzerfaust teams paired with towed 75mm PAK-40 guns dug into reverse slope positions where American artillery couldn't reach them with direct observation. This worked, briefly. A series of engagements along the Stolberg Corridor in October 1944 produced American tank losses at rates approaching the Normandy hedgerow fighting. The 3rd Armored Division's Task Force Lovelady lost 8 Shermans in a single afternoon to a combination of PAK-40 fire and Panzerfaust ambushes in the town of Breinig. 8 tanks. The task force reported combat ready the following morning, with replacement vehicles drawn from the collecting point at Ritgen, 14 miles behind the line. The report uses the word reconstituted, a post-war Army historian noted, as though the task force were a powdered drink mix. Oberst Helmut Ritgen, who commanded Panzerlehr's armored regiment and wrote one of the most detailed FMS manuscripts on Western Front tank combat, identified the core problem with clinical precision in his post-war analysis. We could destroy their tanks faster than we could destroy their willingness to crew new ones. This distinction did not exist on the Eastern Front. Read that again slowly. Ritgen fought in Russia. He knew what Soviet tank crews looked like after taking comparable losses: the demoralization, the mechanical compliance of men ordered into machines they expected to die in. He saw something categorically different in the Americans. The Soviet replacement system also flooded the front with fresh T-34s, but Soviet crews arrived undertrained, often with fewer than 10 hours of driving time and almost no live-fire gunnery practice. They died in enormous numbers and fought with diminishing skill as the training pipeline degraded. American replacement crews arrived at the front, having fired between 80 and 120 main gun rounds during stateside training, driven their tanks cross-country for a minimum of 50 hours, and practiced crew drills until the loader could service the gun breech in darkness by touch alone. The replacement wasn't just a tank. It arrived populated by men who knew how to fight it. This convergence, industrial depth, logistical reach, training quality, and individual willingness to climb back into a machine that had already killed someone in front of you, represented something beyond tactical proficiency. Gersdorff couldn't bomb it away. Ritgen couldn't outkill it. The mixed anti-tank teams in the Stolberg Corridor inflicted losses that would have crippled a panzer division and produced nothing more than a 24-hour administrative delay in American operations. Every German countermeasure addressed one variable in a system that derived its power from the interaction of all variables simultaneously. Shorten the replacement timeline, and the training suffers. Improve the training, and the production volume drops. Except in America, none of that happened. The factories accelerated. The training centers expanded. The crews kept volunteering for armor duty, even after the casualty figures from Normandy filtered back through the replacement depots. The Germans could see the individual gears. They could not see the engine. The diary entry makes sense now. The German officer who wrote those words, "They fought like they couldn't be killed," recorded a sensory observation and mistook it for metaphor. He thought he meant it figuratively. He meant it literally. The crews fought as though destruction carried no permanent consequence because, for the system they served, it didn't. A Sherman burned in a field outside Aachen at 9 a.m. By 4 p.m., a replacement sat on the same road, with a fresh crew zeroing its gun. The officer who watched this happen owned 11 tanks, no replacements, and a maintenance section cannibalizing wrecks for transmission parts. His gunners hit what they aimed at. His tactics worked exactly as designed. His kills counted for nothing. He wrote in his diary because he had nowhere else to put what he'd seen. 5-1. That ratio followed the Sherman home from Europe and settled into the literature like sediment, hardening into something people mistake for history. 5 Shermans to kill 1 tiger. You'll find it in popular histories, in documentaries scored with somber piano music, in forum arguments that generate more heat than a Ronson lighter, touching off hydraulic fluid, in the comments sections of tank restoration videos. The number carries an implicit judgment that American tanks and the men inside them functioned as cannon fodder, quantity substituted for quality, bodies thrown against superior engineering until the engineering ran out of ammunition. The 5-1 claim traces to a 1945 Army operational research study that examined a narrow sample of tank versus tank engagements in the ETO and concluded that destroying a single Panther or Tiger in a head-on engagement typically required the presence of 5 Shermans. Presence. The study didn't say 5 Shermans died per kill. It said 5 needed to be in the fight, maneuvering, suppressing, drawing fire, flanking, so that 1 or 2 could achieve a side or rear shot while the others absorbed the German crew's attention. This is called combined arms tactics. Every army that has ever fielded tanks uses some version of it. The Germans themselves deployed Panzer IVs in groups of 4 to 6 when engaging Soviet KV-1s in 1941 for exactly the same reason. But 5-1, stripped of context, sounds like desperation. And desperation makes a better story than competence. The diary doesn't support the myth. Neither do the German officers who wrote the FMS reports or the men recorded at Trent Park. Ritgen's post-war analysis doesn't support it either. What those sources describe isn't an American force hemorrhaging tanks in futile frontal assaults. They describe a system that made individual tank losses operationally irrelevant, a distinction so foreign to German experience that trained professionals couldn't process it through existing doctrinal frameworks. Panzermeier watched 5 Shermans die and called it a conveyor belt. Ritgen watched kill ratios climb in Germany's favor and called it meaningless. Gersdorf designed an entire operational concept to break the replacement chain and couldn't get a single Focke-Wulf over the target area. Senior officers working the same problem from different angles, arriving at identical conclusions. The Americans had built something that consumed destruction as fuel. Go back to Wehrmacht. 25 rounds into a Tiger's face, 1 dead loader, 1 burned Sherman. The 5-1 theorists would count that engagement as evidence, proof that the Sherman couldn't compete, that American crews paid in blood for decisions made by ordnance boards in Washington. And they'd be right about the 75mm gun. It couldn't penetrate a Tiger frontally at 800 meters. The ballistic tables don't lie. But Wehrmacht didn't die. He walked to the rear, drew a fresh tank, and drove back to the line the same day. The Tiger that killed his Sherman broke down 11 days later with a final drive failure, the Henschel gearbox that plagued every Tiger in Normandy's summer heat, and its crew destroyed it in place to prevent capture. Sources conflict on whether it ever engaged another American tank after Wehrmacht's fight. The records for that specific vehicle end with a demolition report filed by its own battalion. So which ratio matters? 5 tanks to 1 kill. A snapshot of a single engagement frozen in time, stripped of everything that happened before and after? Or 1 crew to infinite tanks, a man who lost his machine, lost his loader, absorbed 25 rounds of failure, and reappeared in the German gun site 4 hours later in a factory-fresh Sherman with a cold gun and a full rack. The German officer in that diary never did the 5-1 math. He didn't need to. He could count his own losses well enough. 20 tanks gone since Normandy, 0 replaced, and he could see the American strength growing on the other side of the line, despite kill claims that should have emptied an entire armored division. His arithmetic produced a different ratio entirely, not tanks per kill, but kills per outcome. And that number, the one that actually determined who held the ground at the end of each day, favored the Americans so completely that the tactical kill ratio ceased to function as a meaningful metric of anything except German marksmanship. The diary sits in College Park. The leather cover still smells faintly of mildew when the archivists open the drawer, or so the finding aid notes. The document itself requires gloves and an appointment. The officer who wrote it surrendered to elements of the 4th Infantry Division near Paderborn in April 1945. He spent 11 months in a POW camp in Arkansas, shipped home in 1946, and took a position with a civil engineering firm in Stuttgart. He never published the diary. His grandson donated it in 2001. Vierling's replacement Sherman, his third of the war, threw a track outside Stolberg in November 1944. Maintenance had it running again in 6 hours. He loaded 17 rounds of 76mm ammunition into the ready rack, traversed the turret forward, and reported his tank operational. 4 crew, 1 replacement loader, full fuel. The platoon moved out at 0730 hours toward the rower.